Welcome, dear traveler, to Medieval Sleep Tales. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Settle into your most comfortable place. Pull a soft blanket close, let the warmth surround you. Tonight we're journeying together into the medieval world, not to study it, but to live within it, to feel its gentle rhythms, to discover the simple beauty of how people welcomed each new day. How did medieval people wake up without alarm clocks? The answer is more beautiful than you might imagine. It's a story written in church bells and candlelight, in roosters crowing and monastery prayers, in the slow dance of shadows across stone walls, and the ancient wisdom of working with nature instead of against it. For the next 3 hours, let yourself drift into this slower world. Whether sleep finds you quickly or you travel this entire journey with me, know that you're safe here, wrapped in the warmth of history, cradled by stories of ordinary people living extraordinary lives with grace and simple ingenuity. So close your eyes when you're ready. Breathe deeply, let the medieval world embrace you like a warm cloak on a cold morning. Our story begins. Part 1. The Sacred Rhythm of Bells. The first light of a medieval dawn arrived not with a jarring alarm, but with the deep, resonant voice of bronze speaking across the sleeping landscape, long before the sun painted the eastern sky with rose and gold. Before the first cock crowed in farmyard coops, the great bells of churches and monasteries began their ancient song. This was how time itself breathed in the medieval world, not in minutes and seconds, but in prayers and bells, in the steady heartbeat of faith that marked every hour of every day. Imagine yourself in a small monastery perched on a hillside in the English countryside. Sometime in the 13th century, the night is still deep and dark, the kind of darkness modern eyes have forgotten, untouched by streetlights or digital glows. Inside the dormitory, monks sleep on simple straw mattresses, their woolen blankets pulled close against the chill. The stone walls hold the cold like a memory, but there is peace here, a profound quiet broken only by the soft breathing of sleeping men and the occasional settling of ancient timbers. In a chamber at the base of the bell tower, a single monk keeps vigil. This is the sacrist, the keeper of sacred time, and his duty is perhaps the most important in the entire monastery. By his side burns a thick candle, marked with careful lines that divide the night into segments. As the flame consumes the wax, it reveals these markers one by one, and when it reaches the appointed hour, the sacrist rises from his prayer stool, pulls on his warmest robe, and climbs the winding stairs to the bell chamber. His feet know every stone step, even in darkness. He has made this climb countless times, in all seasons, in all weathers. The bell rope hangs heavy in his hands. He pauses for a moment, offering a silent prayer, and then pulls. The first strike rings out across a sleeping valley, deep and pure. Once, twice, 3 times the call to matins, the night office, the prayer that greets the darkest hours before dawn. The sound travels far in the still air, rolling over thatched roofs and hedgerows, crossing fields where sheep huddle together for warmth, reaching the ears of villagers in their cottages and laborers in their humble dwellings. This is how medieval people woke, not startled into consciousness by mechanical shrieks, but called gently into the day by sounds that had meaning, by bells that spoke of prayer and community and the sacred ordering of time. The bells were not commands but invitations, not demands but reminders that they were part of something larger than themselves, woven into a fabric of faith and fellowship that stretched back centuries and would continue long after they were gone. In the monastery, the monks stir at the first peal of the bells. There is no rushing, no panic. They have lived their entire lives by this rhythm. Some wake immediately, as if the sound reaches into their dreams and lifts them gently to consciousness. Others need the second and third strikes to fully emerge from sleep. They rise in the darkness, feeling for their robes, slipping felt shoes onto cold feet. No one speaks. The silence is part of the prayer, part of the devotion. They can hear each other moving in the darkness, the rustle of fabric, the soft padding of footsteps, and these sounds are companionship enough. The procession to the chapel is like a river of shadows flowing through stone corridors. Someone has already lit the candles in the church, and their warm light spills through the doorway, golden and welcoming. The monks file into their places in the choir, and as the last man settles onto his bench, they begin to sing. Their voices rise together, Latin words flowing in practiced harmony, filling the vaulted space with beauty. The psalms they sing are the same psalms monks have sung at this hour for centuries, a continuous thread of prayer woven through time itself. But bells didn't only wake those who had dedicated their lives to prayer. In villages and towns across medieval Europe, church bells served as the community's shared timekeeper, the voice that organized the rhythm of daily life for everyone. When the bell for prime rang as dawn began to lighten the sky, bakers were already pulling themselves from their warm beds, knowing that bread needed to be ready for the morning customers. The bell was their signal, more reliable than the changing sunrise, more consistent than the variable light of different seasons. The baker's wife might nudge her husband gently at the first sound of the bells. "Time to rise, love," she would murmur, though he was likely already stirring, his body trained by years of early rising to anticipate the call. Together they would dress in the dim light of banked coals in the hearth, pulling on layers of woolen linen against the morning chill. The bakehouse stood separate from their living quarters, a wise precaution against fire. And crossing the small courtyard in the pre-dawn darkness was always a moment of transition from sleep's warmth to work's demands. Inside the bakehouse, the ovens would still hold heat from the previous day's baking. The husband would feed the fire, carefully adding wood, building the flames back to proper strength while his wife began measuring flour and salt, mixing the first batches of dough. The work had its own rhythm, a meditation of hands in flour, of kneading and shaping. And as they worked, they could hear other sounds of the village waking around them. A door opening, the clatter of a bucket, the low murmur of voices as neighbors greeted each other in passing. In the castle on the hill overlooking the village, the bells served a similar purpose, but in a more complex hierarchy of waking. The lord and lady of the manor might sleep until the 3rd or 4th hour after dawn, but the castle never truly slept. Guards changed watch through the night, the rhythm of their shifts marking time in its own way. Kitchen servants rose in darkness to begin preparations for the day's meals, their movements guided by both the distant church bells and by candle clocks that burned in the kitchen itself. A candle clock was a beautiful thing, simple yet ingenious. A thick candle of uniform width would be marked at intervals, each mark representing a certain passage of time. As the candle burned, these marks would be consumed one by one, allowing anyone who glanced at it to know roughly what hour it was. Some households used candles with metal pins inserted at specific heights. As the wax melted, each pin would fall into a metal plate with a distinct ping, creating a gentle auditory signal that time had passed. A kitchen servant might set a candle with a pin timed to fall when it was time to begin heating the ovens, ensuring bread would be ready when the household began to stir. The lady's chambermaid would wake to the sound of the prime bells, rising from her small pallet bed near her mistress's door. She would dress quickly but quietly, not wanting to disturb the lady's rest, and make her way through the still dark corridors to the kitchen to fetch warm water for washing. The castle at this hour had a particular quality, a hushed expectancy, as if the very stones were holding their breath between night and day. Torches burned low in their sconces, casting long shadows that danced with every draught of air. The maid's footsteps echoed softly on the stone floors, a lonely sound but not frightening, for she knew every turn and corner of these passages. By the time she returned with the warmed water and fresh linens, the sky beyond the narrow windows would be showing the first hints of gray. The maid would knock softly on the chamber door, enter at the lady's sleepy permission, and begin the gentle process of helping her mistress transition from sleep to waking. There was no rush here, no jarring awakening. The lady might lie abed for a few moments more, listening to the sounds of the castle coming to life around her, distant voices, footsteps on stairs, the clang of pots from the kitchen far below, before finally rising to face the day. In humble cottages scattered across the countryside, waking followed different patterns but no less natural rhythms. Here, where families lived in single rooms with sleeping lofts accessible by wooden ladders, the rooster's crow often served as the primary alarm, but it wasn't the jarring sound you might imagine. Medieval roosters, like medieval people, were attuned to the gradual lightening of the sky, and their first calls came softly, tentatively, as if testing whether the dawn was truly ready to arrive. Only as the light grew stronger would their crowing grow more insistent and loud, A peasant farmer would wake to that first soft call, his senses attuned to the subtle changes in light and sound that marked the transition from night to day. His wife beside him might already be stirring, for women often woke even earlier than men, needing to rekindle the fire and prepare a simple breakfast before the day's work truly began. In winter, when darkness lingered long into what would become the working day, waking was more about sensing the approaching dawn than seeing it, about feeling the subtle shift in the air that said morning was coming, even if the sun had not yet shown its face. Their cottage would be cold, breath visible in the air, and the first task was always to revive the fire from the banked coals of the night before. A good housewife took pride in keeping her fire alive through the night, covering the coals with ash to preserve their heat, for rekindling from scratch was laborious work. She would kneel before the hearth in the dim light, carefully removing the ash covering, breathing gently on the glowing coals beneath, adding the finest kindling first, then slightly larger pieces, building the flames back to life. As warmth began to spread from the hearth, the cottage would gradually transform from a cold cave into a living space once more. Children in the sleeping loft would wake to the sounds and smells of this morning ritual, the crackle of kindling catching, the murmur of their parents' voices, the scent of wood smoke mixing with a warmer smell of porridge beginning to heat over the newly revived fire. There was no need to rush down immediately. The warmth of their shared sleeping space, their bodies huddled together under woolen blankets and sheepskins, was precious, and parents understood this. Rising would come soon enough, but these first moments of waking, of lying still and listening to the world come to life, were a gentle gift. Timekeeping in the medieval world was fundamentally different from our modern obsession with precise minutes and seconds. People thought in terms of the canonical hours: matins in the deep night, lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour of daylight, terce at the third hour, sext at midday, none at the ninth hour, vespers at evening, and compline before bed. These weren't fixed to exact clock times, but moved with the seasons, with the length of daylight expanding and contracting through the year. A summer morning hour was longer than a winter morning hour. Time was flexible, organic, tied to the natural world rather than fighting against it. This might seem imprecise to modern minds, but it created a beautiful harmony with the rhythms of nature. People woke when waking was appropriate to their life and season, not at some arbitrary number on a digital display. A farmer in summer would wake much earlier than in winter, because there was more daylight to work with and more work to be done. A scholar might sleep later, rising when sufficient light entered his chamber to read by. A merchant might wake with the church bells but linger in bed until full daylight made travel safe, especially in winter when roads were treacherous and bandits bolder in the long darkness. The wealthy had more options for waking at specific times. They could afford to keep servants whose job included timekeeping duties. A valet might wake at a prescribed hour by his own internal clock, honed by years of early rising, and then gently wake his master with whispered words and drawn curtains. Water clocks, though rare and expensive, appeared in some noble households and monasteries. These remarkable devices used the steady drip of water from one container to another to measure time, and could be calibrated with remarkable accuracy. Some included mechanisms that would ring small bells or move indicators when certain hours arrived, providing a more mechanical means of timekeeping, though still far gentler than modern alarms. The most sophisticated water clocks were true marvels of medieval engineering. In monastery scriptoriums and cathedral treasuries, you might find devices where water dripped through carefully calibrated holes, turning gears that moved hands on a dial or released weighted hammers that struck bells. Monks studied these mechanisms with the same reverence they brought to sacred texts, understanding that measuring time was, in its way, a holy pursuit, a means of ordering their prayers and bringing regularity to their service of God. But for most people, waking was a matter of natural cues and community rhythm. The human body, unconfused by artificial light and unbound by the strictures of industrial time, proved remarkably capable of maintaining its own schedule. Go to bed at roughly the same time each night, wake at roughly the same time each morning, and the body learns, adjusts, becomes its own timekeeper. Medieval people understood this intuitively. They lived it every day. There was also a practice, particularly in winter, of segmented sleep that seems strange to modern minds but made perfect sense in a world without electric light. People would sleep for several hours after sunset, then wake naturally in the middle of the night for an hour or two of quiet wakefulness. This was considered a peaceful, productive time. Couples might talk softly, sharing thoughts they didn't have time for during the busy day. Individuals might pray, think, or attend to small tasks that required concentration. Then they would return to bed for a second sleep that carried them through to morning. This pattern wasn't forced or artificial. It emerged naturally from the body's rhythms when freed from the constraints of modern scheduling. In cities, the night watchmen served as living clocks, calling out the hours as they patrolled the streets. 2 o'clock and all is well might echo through narrow lanes, bouncing off timber-framed buildings, reaching sleepers in their beds and offering reassurance that the night was passing peacefully, that order was maintained, that morning would come in due time. These calls weren't intended to wake people but to mark time's passage, to provide orientation for those who might stir and wonder what hour it was, whether they should rise or return to sleep. The watchman's call was part of a tapestry of sounds that defined medieval nights and mornings. In coastal towns, the sound of waves and gulls. In forest villages, the calls of owls and the rustle of wind through leaves. In farming country, the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep as animals too began to wake with the coming dawn. All of these sounds wove together into a rich auditory landscape that people learned to read as easily as we read the glowing numbers on our bedside clocks. Monasteries developed the most sophisticated systems for ensuring monks woke at the proper hours, because their entire purpose revolved around the cycle of prayer. In addition to the sacrist who tended the candle clock and rang the bells, some monasteries employed a practice called the knocking up, where one monk, having woken by whatever means, would physically go to each cell and tap on the door to ensure everyone rose for the night offices. This monk might wake himself using a mental determination cultivated through years of discipline, or might be roused by the sacrist specifically for this duty. There are records of mechanical innovations designed specifically to help monks wake. One account describes a candle with a string tied to the monk's toe. As the candle burned down, it would burn through the string, and the sudden release would tug the toe and wake the sleeper. Whether this actually worked or was more theoretical is unclear, but it speaks to the creative problem-solving medieval people brought to the challenge of timekeeping and waking. What strikes modern hearts when contemplating medieval waking is not the mechanics of it, but the quality. There was no violence in it, no assault on the senses. Waking was a gradual process, a gentle emergence from one state into another. The sounds that called people to consciousness, bells, roosters, watchmen's calls, birdsong, were all natural or naturally paced human sounds. They rose and fell. They had melody and rhythm. They didn't demand immediate alertness but invited gradual awareness. Even in the darkest winter mornings, when waking was hardest and the cold most bitter, there was a sense of rightness to it. The bells rang because prayer was called for. The rooster crowed because dawn was approaching. The fire needed tending because the household needed warmth. Every waking had purpose woven into it, connection to something larger than the individual. You didn't wake because a machine commanded it, but because you were part of a community, part of a rhythm, part of the great turning of the world from darkness into light. Consider the experience of a young apprentice in a craftsman's workshop, sleeping in the loft above the shop. He would wake to his master's movements below, the sound of the shop door being unbarred, the scrape of the workshop shutters being opened to let in the morning light. These sounds would reach him in his dreams first, weaving into his sleeping consciousness, preparing him for waking before his eyes ever opened. By the time he climbed down the ladder, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, his master would have the workshop ready for the day's labor, and a simple breakfast would be waiting: bread and cheese, perhaps, or porridge with a bit of honey if times were good. The quality of light in medieval mornings was different too. Without electric bulbs, the transition from night to day was more gradual and more profound. The first light was deeply blue, almost purple, revealing shapes and shadows but not colors. As the sun rose, warmth entered the light, and the world would slowly paint itself back into being: the red of a roof tile, the green of new grass, the brown of thatched walls. Waking into this gradual illumination felt like watching creation happen anew each day. In noble households, this transition was marked with ceremony and care. The lady's chamber would be prepared before she woke, fire built up, candles lit to supplement the growing daylight, fresh rushes laid on the floor if needed, everything made clean and welcoming. When she opened her eyes, you would see not stark morning light, but a room already glowing with warmth and care, testimony to servants who had risen before her to ensure her comfort. The Lord might wake to similar preparations, but with a different quality. His chamber would emphasize readiness for action, clothing laid out, weapons cleaned and ready if he had martial duties, correspondence or documents prepared if he had administrative work. But there was still gentleness in it, still the sense that waking was a transition to be respected, not rushed. For those who kept their night watch, guards on castle walls, shepherds with their flocks in lambing season, sentries at city gates, waking had a different character entirely. Their sleep was often broken, taken in snatches, and they learned to wake instantly at the smallest sound that might signal danger. Yet even they, when their watch ended and they could seek proper rest, would wake to the same bells and natural cues as everyone else, returning to the communal rhythm when their special duties released them. The seasons added another layer to waking patterns. Summer mornings came early and bright, with bird song in full throat and warm breezes carrying the scent of growing things. Winter mornings were dark and hard, with frost on the inside of windows and breath visible in the air. Spring mornings held promise and renewal, while autumn mornings carried a poignant beauty, the sense of abundance tinged with the knowledge that darkness was returning. Medieval people were deeply attuned to these seasonal qualities, and their waking reflected this awareness, shaped by it and shaping it in turn. Part 2. The wisdom of water, wax, and sun, beyond the bells and roosters. Beyond the simple reliance on natural light and internal rhythms, medieval people developed a remarkable array of gentle technologies and practices for measuring time and ensuring they woke when needed. These weren't harsh or mechanical, but flowed with the same organic quality that defined all medieval timekeeping. They worked with nature rather than against it, honoring the slow passage of hours rather than trying to chop time into ever smaller fragments. The water clock, or clepsydra as scholars called it, using the ancient Greek term, represented one of humanity's oldest and most elegant solutions to measuring time. In its simplest form, it was nothing more than a vessel with a small hole near the bottom, filled with water that dripped out at a steady rate. By marking lines on the inside of the vessel, you could see at a glance how much time had passed based on how much water remained. More sophisticated versions used the dripping water to fill a second vessel marked with hour lines, so you could measure time by watching the water level rise rather than fall. In a monastery scriptorium on a hillside in France, imagine such a device sitting on a stone shelf near a window. The vessel is made of glazed pottery, pale green with careful markings etched into its surface. A monk responsible for timing the copying sessions fills it at the start of each work period, and as the hours pass, he glances at it periodically. When the water reaches a certain mark, he knows it's time to ring a small bell that signals the scribes to pause, to rest their cramping hands, to step away from their careful work and take refreshment. This isn't about driving them to work harder, but about protecting them from working too long, from damaging their eyes and hands in service to the sacred task of preserving knowledge. The water makes the softest sound as it drips, a gentle plink 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 that becomes part of the scriptorium's soundscape, mixing with the scratch of quills on parchment, the rustle of pages being turned, the quiet breathing of men bent over their work. Some monks find this sound meditative, a reminder that time flows like water, steady and patient, that their work too should flow with the same peaceful constancy. In warmer months, water clocks worked beautifully, their steady dripping as reliable as the movement of the sun. But winter posed challenges. Water could freeze, stopping the clock entirely or cracking the vessel. Some monasteries kept their water clocks in heated rooms for this reason, or used other liquids that wouldn't freeze, oil, though expensive, or wine in small quantities. Others simply relied more heavily on candle clocks during the cold months, accepting that different seasons called for different solutions. The candle clock deserves more attention, for it was perhaps the most common timing device in medieval households beyond the great church bells. Picture a wealthy merchant's house in a prosperous English town, sometime in the 14th century. The family room glows with firelight as evening settles in. On a special stand near the hearth burns a thick tallow candle, as long as a man's forearm, carefully marked with evenly spaced lines. Each line represents 1 hour, and small brass pins have been inserted into the wax at certain marks. The merchant's wife has placed a metal plate beneath the candle. As the family sits around the fire, the merchant reviewing his accounts by candlelight, his wife working on her embroidery, the children playing a quiet board game on the floor, the candle burns steadily downward. When the flame reaches the first pin, the wax around it melts, and suddenly the pin drops free, striking the metal plate with a clear, bright ping. The sound is gentle but unmistakable, and everyone looks up, acknowledging the passage of another hour. This sound has meaning woven into it. Perhaps it signals that the children should begin preparing for bed. Perhaps it reminds the merchant that he promised to walk with his wife in the garden before full darkness fell. Perhaps it's simply a marker, a gentle reminder that time is flowing, that the evening is passing, that all things move forward in their season. There's no alarm, no shrillness, just this musical ping of metal on metal, almost pleasant in its clarity. Some candle clocks were even more sophisticated. In monasteries and wealthy households, you might find candles with different colored wax sections, each color representing a different period of the day or night. A monk responsible for night prayers might have a candle that burned white for the first hours after sunset, then blue as it approached the time for matins, then red as dawn approached. Even in dim light, he could glance at the candle and know roughly what hour it was by which color was currently burning. There were also candles formed in special shapes, spirals or coils that would burn for many hours, their twisted forms ensuring a long, slow consumption of wax. These might be used by those who needed to mark very long periods, or who wanted a single candle to last through an entire night. A midwife attending a woman in labor might have such a candle, both as a light source and as a way to track how many hours the labor had lasted. Information that could be important for the mother's safety. The ingenuity of medieval timekeeping extended to the use of incense as well, particularly in monasteries and among contemplative religious communities. Incense clocks worked on a similar principle to candle clocks but used carefully prepared sticks or coils of incense that burned at predictable rates. These had the advantage of producing less light than candles, making them ideal for timing prayers during hours when darkness was preferred for meditation. They also filled the air with fragrant sandalwood, frankincense, myrrh, transforming timekeeping into a multi-sensory experience. Imagine a hermit in a small stone cell on the edge of a forest, far from any church bells or community sounds. He has chosen solitude as his path to God, but he still wishes to pray at the canonical hours to maintain that connection to the broader rhythm of Christian devotion. He cannot hear bells, has no one to wake him, so he uses incense sticks marked at intervals. When he rises for the night office, he lights a stick and begins his prayers. The incense burns slowly, filling his cell with sweet smoke, and when the burning reaches a certain mark, he knows that the appropriate time for prayer has passed, that he should now return to sleep until the next office. The scent becomes part of his prayer life, inseparable from his devotions. Years later, even the slightest whiff of frankincense would instantly transport him back to those quiet hours of night prayer. The stone walls around him, the darkness broken only by a single candle flame, the sense of profound solitude and equally profound connection to something vast and holy. Sundials, of course, were useless for waking people in the morning, since they required sunlight to function, but they played their role in the broader tapestry of medieval timekeeping. Every monastery, every church of any size, most noble estates and many prosperous townhouses had sundials, some simple, just a stick casting a shadow on a marked surface, others elaborate affairs carved from stone or cast in bronze, with intricate hour lines and seasonal adjustments. These devices served during the day to calibrate other timepieces. The sacrist responsible for the monastery's candle clocks would check them against the sundial on sunny days, ensuring the candles were burning at the proper rate, adjusting future candles if needed. This created a chain of timekeeping. The sun, eternal and unchanging, measured by the sundial. The sundial used to calibrate candles and water clocks. The candles and water clocks used to mark hours when the sun was hidden or gone, and all of this woven together with the human element of practiced internal rhythms and communal bells. But beyond all these devices and technologies, perhaps the most sophisticated timekeeping mechanism medieval people possessed was their own bodies and minds, trained through years of living in close harmony with natural rhythms. Modern sleep science has discovered what medieval people knew intuitively. The human body has an internal clock, a circadian rhythm that, when allowed to function naturally, can maintain remarkably consistent sleep and wake cycles. A farmer who went to bed shortly after sunset every night and needed to wake at dawn would find, after a few weeks of this pattern, that he began to wake naturally just before sunrise, his body anticipating the transition from sleep to waking. A monk who prayed at the same hours day after day, year after year, would develop such a strong internal sense of these times that he might wake moments before the bells rang. His body prepared for the prayer to come. This wasn't magic or mysticism. Though medieval people might have interpreted it through religious lenses, seeing it as God's design working within them, it was simply the human organism functioning as it was meant to, unconfused by electric lights that trick the brain into thinking day extends far into the night, undisturbed by the irregular schedules that modern life demands. In a shepherd's hut high in the Welsh hills, a man and his son tend their flocks through lambing season. They need to check the pregnant ewes every few hours through the night, ensuring no mother struggles alone. No lamb is lost to cold or predators. They don't have elaborate clocks or mechanisms. Instead, they've developed a rhythm: sleep for a few hours, wake naturally through a combination of light internal training and the sounds of the flock, a particular quality of bleating that signals distress, a change in the wind, the movement of the dog who also keeps watch. They rise, pull on their warmest cloaks, take up a lantern and walk among the sheep, offering assistance where needed. Then back to the hut, back to sleep, and the cycle repeats. This is exhausting work, but there's also something deeply right about it. Something that connects them to countless generations of shepherds before them, all the way back to biblical times and beyond. They're living in a pattern as old as animal husbandry itself. Their sleep fragmented but still restorative. Their waking purposeful and necessary. In this context, waking isn't an imposition but a form of service, of care, of participating in the great cycle of life that surrounds them. Women, particularly, develop sophisticated internal senses of time, especially mothers of young children. A nursing mother would wake naturally when her baby needed feeding, often moments before the infant began to fuss. Over time, this created a rhythm between mother and child, their bodies synchronizing in a beautiful biological dance. The mother's sleep, though interrupted, wasn't as fragmented as it might seem to modern eyes, because each waking was expected, prepared for, and brief. She would nurse the child in the warm darkness, perhaps dozing while the baby fed, then settle the infant back into sleep and return to her own rest, all without full waking or disruption of the household. In castle nurseries, wet nurses and nursemaids would develop similar rhythms with the noble children in their care. A nursemaid might sleep in the same chamber as the young lord or lady she tended, and would wake at the slightest sound of distress or discomfort. But she also learned to sleep through normal baby sounds, the small sighs and movements of healthy infant sleep, conserving her energy for when she was truly needed. The elderly often became the best timekeepers in their communities, their long years of life creating such strong internal rhythms that they could wake at almost any predetermined hour simply through intention. A grandmother might say at bedtime, "I'll wake at cockcrow to tend the morning fire," and her body, trained by decades of early rising, would rouse her at precisely that time. Young people would marvel at this ability, not understanding that they too were developing it day by day, laying down the neural pathways and bodily rhythms that would serve them in their own old age. There was also a practice, particularly among scholars and those who needed to wake at irregular hours, of drinking a certain quantity of water before bed. The body's need to relieve itself would then serve as a natural alarm, waking the sleeper after a predictable number of hours. This was used deliberately by some, who calibrated how much water to drink based on when they needed to wake. A scholar who needed to rise at midnight to study by candlelight while the household slept might drink 2 cups of water before retiring at sunset. A merchant who needed to begin his journey at an unusually early hour might use this method to ensure he didn't oversleep. It sounds crude to modern ears, but medieval people were practical about bodily functions in ways we've become squeamish about. The body's needs and rhythms were seen as tools to work with, not embarrassments to hide. Using natural bodily functions as timekeepers was no stranger than using roosters or candles, or were simply aspects of the world that could be observed, understood, and employed for useful purposes. The changing seasons brought their own natural alarms and timekeepers. In spring, as days lengthened and birds returned from their winter grounds, the dawn chorus would begin earlier each day, providing a gradual adjustment to earlier waking times. A farmer didn't suddenly have to wake an hour earlier when spring planting began. Rather, the increasing birdsong and earlier sunrise naturally drew him from sleep progressively earlier, week by week, his body adjusting gradually to the changing demands of the agricultural year. In autumn, as days shortened and darkness came earlier, sleep patterns naturally extended. There was more time for rest, for sitting by the fire in the long evenings, for sleep to deepen and extend through longer nights. This matched perfectly with the agricultural cycle after the exhausting work of harvest. The body needed more rest, and nature provided exactly that through longer nights. Winter sleep had a particular quality all its own. With darkness falling so early and lasting so long, medieval people often adopted the segmented sleep pattern mentioned earlier. First sleep would come shortly after sunset, lasting 4 or 5 hours. Then a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night called the watching, or the watch, during which people might pray, tend the fire, make love, talk quietly, or engage in simple handwork that didn't require much light. Then second sleep would carry them through to morning. This pattern wasn't universal, but it was common enough to be documented in personal letters, legal depositions, and medical texts of the era. During the watch, time had a dreamlike quality. The world was deeply asleep, but you were awake within that sleeping world, cocooned in darkness and quiet. Some people found this period deeply peaceful, a time when worries seemed less pressing, when thought could meander without demands or interruptions. A husband and wife might talk about things they never found time for during the busy day. A mother might nurse her baby and, instead of immediately returning to sleep, might sit by the banked fire, holding the warm weight of her child, letting her mind drift through memories and dreams. There are records of the watch being considered a particularly favorable time for prayer and contemplation. The silence was so profound, the sense of isolation from the busy world so complete, that connection to the divine felt more accessible. Some people reported having their most vivid dreams not in first sleep or second sleep but during the watch, as if the mind, released from full sleep but not yet engaged with worldly concerns, could roam freely through realms of symbol and meaning. For those who lived in religious communities, the night offices, matins, and lauds fell naturally during what would otherwise be the watch. Rather than lying awake alone, monks would gather in the church, their communal prayer filling the hours between sleeps. After the office concluded, they would return to their cells for second sleep, the prayers they'd offered serving as a kind of bridge between the two periods of rest, sanctifying the entire night. The practice of learning to wake at a predetermined hour without mechanical assistance was actually taught in some monastic communities. A novice monk might be instructed by his elder, "Before you sleep, hold clearly in your mind the hour at which you must wake, see it, feel it, know it with certainty, offer a prayer that God will rouse you at the needed time, then release the worry and sleep in peace." This wasn't superstition but a practical application of what we now call autosuggestion or intention setting combined with faith. And remarkably, it worked. Monks became so adept at this practice that they could reliably wake themselves at almost any hour they chose, their internal sense of time's passage functioning with impressive accuracy. Modern sleep studies have confirmed that this is indeed possible. The human mind, when given clear intention before sleep, can track time even while unconscious and trigger waking at a predetermined moment. There were also communal practices that helped ensure people woke when needed. In some villages, the night watchman's rounds included tapping on the shutters of households where someone had requested a wake-up call. A baker might ask the watchman to tap on his window at the 4th hour after midnight. A merchant might request a call before dawn to prepare for an early journey. This service was informal, often paid for with a loaf of bread or a cup of ale, part of the web of mutual assistance that held communities together. In cities, there were even early versions of professional waking services. A knocker-up might be employed to wake workers who needed to be at their posts at specific times. Using a long pole, the knocker-up would tap on bedroom windows at the requested hour, waiting until someone acknowledged the wake-up call before moving on. This profession would continue well past the medieval period, lasting in some places into the industrial age, a human alarm clock walking the streets in the early morning darkness. But for most medieval people, most of the time, waking was a gentler, more organic process than any of these deliberate methods. It was about living in harmony with light and dark, with the rhythms of community and prayer, with the natural needs of the body in the changing seasons. It was about trusting that the day would begin when it was meant to begin, that waking would come in its proper time, that there was no need to force or fight against the natural flow of rest and activity. The morning itself was greeted not with groaning or resistance but with gratitude. Night had passed safely. Sleep had been restful. The new day was a gift, an opportunity, a fresh beginning. The first words upon waking might be a prayer of thanksgiving or a quiet greeting to a sleeping spouse or simply a deep breath of acceptance and readiness. There was no sense of time stolen or lost, no frantic checking of how many minutes remained before obligations began. Time was generous, abundant, moving at a human pace. As light grew in the window, as the sounds of the waking world multiplied, bells and birds, voices and footsteps, the creak of doors and the clatter of buckets, each person would rise in their own time, when their own body and circumstances said the moment was right. A child might linger in the warmth of the sleeping loft while parents moved about below. A lord might rise immediately, energized by sleep and eager to begin the day. A laborer might take a few moments to stretch and wake slowly, preparing his body for the physical demands ahead. There was wisdom in this varied, flexible approach to waking. It honored individual differences in constitution and need. It recognized that a farmer in harvest season and a scholar in winter had different requirements, different rhythms. It understood that waking was not a moment but a process, a gentle transition that deserved respect and care. The medieval world, for all its hardships and limitations, offered its people this gift, the ability to wake as humans were meant to wake, called forth into consciousness by sounds and sights that had meaning, that connected them to their communities and their purpose, that made waking not a rude interruption of rest but a natural continuation of the great cycle of life. Part 3. The sacred threshold of dawn. There is something profound about the moment between sleep and waking. That threshold where consciousness returns like a tide slowly covering the shore. Medieval people, unrushed by the demands of industrial time, experienced this transition with a fullness and richness that modern life has largely forgotten. To wake in the medieval world was to participate in a daily miracle, a small resurrection that echoed the great cosmic cycle of death and rebirth, darkness and light, that governed all existence. Consider a young woman in a convent somewhere in the Italian countryside. The year perhaps 1320, she sleeps in a narrow cell, little more than a stone alcove with a wooden door, furnished simply with a straw pallet, a woolen blanket, a small wooden cross on the wall. The night has been deep and still, a sleep profound in the way that comes from a day spent in prayer, work, and contemplation. She has gone to bed with the taste of the evening's simple meal still on her tongue, bread and cheese, a few dried figs, watered wine in her body, weary from hours of standing in the chapel and laboring in the convent's herb garden, has welcomed sleep like a friend. Now, in the darkest hours before dawn, something begins to shift. First, in her dreams, which have been peaceful and fragmentary images of the garden, of sunlight through leaves, of the sisters' voices singing in harmony, the dreams start to change, to lighten, as if a window was slowly opening in her sleeping mind. Then, faintly, from a great distance, she hears a sound. At first, it weaves into her dreams, becomes part of the dream landscape. But gradually, gently, it pulls her upward, toward consciousness. It is the bell for matins, struck by the sister sacristan in the chapel tower. The sound reaches through stone walls and wooden doors, soft but persistent, a bronze voice calling the community to prayer. Our young nun stirs, her eyes still closed, awareness returning slowly. She becomes conscious of her body, the stiffness in her knees from kneeling in prayer yesterday, the warmth of the blanket, the cool air on her face. She hears her own breathing slow and deep. She feels the straw of her mattress beneath her, the rough wool of her habit that she has slept in, for changing clothes requires a luxury of garments the convent cannot afford. She doesn't leap from bed. There is time. The bell rings and a pattern 3 strikes. A pause, 3 more strikes, another pause, and so on. This gives the sisters time to wake, to orient themselves, to prepare. She lies still for a moment longer, offering a silent prayer of thanks for the night's rest, for the safety of sleep, for the gift of another day to serve. Then she sits up slowly, feeling the blood flow change, the world shift from horizontal to vertical. In the darkness of her cell, she reaches for the candle and flint that sit on a small shelf near her bed. The striking of the flint, the catching of the spark on the prepared tinder, the tiny flame growing on the wick, these are actions she has performed countless times, and her hands know the movements even in darkness. The candle catches, and suddenly her cell is filled with warm, flickering light. She can see her breath misting in the cold air. It is late winter, and even here in Italy, the nights are chill. She rises from her pallet, kneels briefly at the cross to offer another short prayer, then wraps her thickest cloak around her shoulders and opens her door. The corridor is already moving with soft light and softer footsteps. Other sisters are emerging from their cells, candles in hand, faces still soft with sleep, but beginning to sharpen into wakefulness. No one speaks. The silence is part of their rule, especially at this hour, but there is communication in the gentle nods, the small smiles, the shared understanding that they are all undertaking this journey from sleep to prayer together. They move as a quiet river toward the chapel, their footsteps whispering on stone floors, their candle flames creating a moving constellation of light through the dark corridors. In the chapel, more candles have already been lit by the sister responsible for preparing the space. The altar glows, the shadows dance on ancient walls. The sisters file into their places, setting their candles on designated shelves, settling onto their wooden benches. The prioress arrives last, her step measured and dignified even at this dark hour. She takes her place, and after a moment of collective silence, they begin. Their voices rise together in the Latin words of the psalm, and as they sing, something happens that occurs every morning but never loses its wonder. Waking completes itself. The act of singing, of offering these ancient words to God, brings full consciousness. Their minds, which were foggy with sleep when they first entered the chapel, become clear and focused. The beauty of the harmonies, the meaning of the prayers, the sense of participating in something that stretches back through centuries and forward into eternity. All of this awakens not just their bodies but their spirits. As the office progresses through its prayers and psalms, the young nun we've been following finds herself filled with a quiet joy. Yes, she is tired. Yes, the chapel is cold. Yes, she would rather be warm in her bed. But there is also this, the profound peace of being exactly where she is meant to be, doing exactly what she is meant to do. This is her purpose, her calling, and in fulfilling it, even in these difficult dark hours, she finds a deep contentment that transcends comfort. When Matins concludes, the sisters don't immediately return to bed, though they could. Some choose to remain in the chapel for personal prayer. Others return to their cells but stay awake, using the quiet hours for contemplation or reading if they have sufficient candle and light. The young nun returns to her cell, but instead of lying down, she sits on her bed, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and begins to mentally prepare for the day ahead. She thinks about the work in the herb garden that needs attention, about a sister who has been unwell and might need comfort, about a passage of scripture that puzzled her and that she wants to discuss with the prioress when opportunity allows. This time between matins and lauds, between the deep night office and the dawn prayer, has a liminal quality. It is neither fully night nor fully day, neither entirely sleep nor entirely waking. It is a space between spaces, and in it, thoughts can move freely, unencumbered by the demands of the waking world, yet freed from the unconsciousness of sleep. Some of the young nun's most profound spiritual insights have come to her during these hours, gifts of clarity that arrive unbidden in the quiet darkness. When the bell rings again for lauds, she is ready. This time, her movement toward the chapel is different. She is fully awake now, her mind clear, her spirit prepared, and when she steps outside into the corridor, she notices something she missed during the Matins procession. There is the faintest lightening of the darkness outside the narrow windows. Dawn is approaching. The world is preparing to transform from night to day, and she and her sisters will sing it into being with their prayers. Hundreds of miles to the north, in a Viking settlement on the coast of what will someday be called Norway, waking follows a different rhythm but carries the same quality of purpose and meaning. A fisherman sleeps in his longhouse surrounded by his extended family, wife, children, his elderly mother, his brother's family, all sharing the communal warmth of the single large room. The fire in the central hearth has been carefully banked for the night, covered with ash to preserve the coals, but even so, the edges of the room are cold, and frost has formed on the inside of the walls where the warmth doesn't reach. The fisherman wakes not to bells but to his own internal sense of time, honed by years of rising before dawn to catch the tide. His eyes open, and for a moment he lies perfectly still, listening. He hears the breathing of his sleeping family, the distant sound of waves on the shore, the wind moving around the longhouse. He listens specifically for the quality of the wind, for it will tell him whether today is a day for fishing or a day for staying ashore. The wind sounds steady, strong but not violent. Good. He rises slowly, careful not to disturb his wife who sleeps beside him. Their youngest child is tucked between them, still small enough to need the extra warmth. He slips from under the fur blankets, bear and sealskins that have kept his family warm through many winters, and immediately the cold hits him. His breath makes clouds in the dim light of the banked fire. He pulls on his warmest tunic, his thick woolen trousers, his sealskin boots. His movements are practiced, efficient, making almost no sound. Before leaving the longhouse, he kneels by the fire and carefully uncovers the coals. They still glow red in the ash, and he feels a moment of satisfaction. His wife did well in banking them last night. He adds the finest kindling, breathing gently to encourage the flames. Fire is sacred, life-giving, and tending it is a responsibility he shares with reverence. As the flames begin to grow, he adds slightly larger pieces of wood, building the fire back to strength. The warmth will spread through the longhouse and his family will wake to comfort rather than cold. Now he can leave. He steps out into the pre-dawn darkness, and the cold is shocking, far more intense than inside the longhouse. The sky is still fully dark, but there is something in the quality of that darkness, a subtle difference that tells him dawn is perhaps an hour away. The stars are brilliant overhead, the constellation patterns he knows as well as the lines of his own hand. He uses them for navigation when fishing, and they're old friends, familiar and reliable. He walks down to the shore, his feet knowing the path even in darkness. Other men are already there, shadows moving around the boats, preparing for the day's fishing. They greet each other with quiet words, voices hushed in the pre-dawn stillness. There is camaraderie here, a shared understanding of what it means to leave warmth and sleep for cold and work, to entrust your life to the sea and your skill. They work together to prepare the boat, checking ropes and nets, ensuring everything is ready, and then they wait. Not long, but they wait for the right moment. The tide must be turning, the light must be sufficient to see by. They stand together on the shore, these men who have known each other all their lives, and they watch the east. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the darkness begins to change. Not lighter exactly, but less complete. The horizon becomes distinguishable from the sky. The water begins to show itself as separate from the land. One of the older fishermen, a man with gray in his beard and decades of mornings like this behind him, makes a small sound, not quite words, but a signal. Time. They push the boat into the water, the shock of the cold sea on their legs making them gasp, and then they're aboard, oars out, pulling away from shore. Behind them, the settlement is beginning to wake. Smoke rises from other longhouses as fires are rekindled. A dog barks, a baby cries, but the fishermen are already pulling toward the fishing grounds, their backs to the waking village, their faces toward the sea and the growing light. For them, waking is inseparable from work. from the demands of survival, from the rhythm of tide and season. There is no leisurely transition from sleep to waking, no gentle contemplation. Yet there is still meaning in it, still a sense of rightness. They wake because the tide calls, because the fish are running, because their families need to eat. Their waking is purposeful, and in that purpose they find their identity and worth. Back in the longhouse, the fisherman's wife wakes to warmth and firelight. Her husband is gone, but she expected this. She knows the rhythm of his leaving and returning as well as she knows the rhythm of her own breath. She lies for a moment more, enjoying the warmth, feeling the small body of their youngest child curled against her. Then she too rises, begins her own day's work, feeding the fire, preparing the morning meal, waking the children, setting the older ones to their tasks, checking on the elderly mother-in-law, beginning the endless cycle of work that keeps a household running. Her waking is different from her husband's, but no less purposeful. She is the heart of the home, the keeper of the fire, both literal and metaphorical. When she wakes, the household wakes. When she sets things in motion, the whole complex machinery of domestic life begins to turn. There is satisfaction in this, a deep pride in her competence and her role. Across the medieval world, in countless variations, this pattern repeats. In a scholar's cell at a university in Bologna, a young man wakes to candlelight and reaches immediately for the book he was reading before sleep claimed him, eager to continue his studies. In a leper house outside Paris, those afflicted with the terrible disease wake to another day of suffering, but also to the care of devoted religious who tend them with compassion. In a merchant's comfortable house in Venice, a man wakes to check on the arrival of ships that might carry goods for his trade. In a peasant's cottage in Poland, a woman wakes to milk the cow and begin the day's bread. Each waking is unique, shaped by individual circumstances, yet all share certain qualities. There is acceptance, this is what life requires, and so it is done. There is connection to something beyond the self, family, community, faith, duty. There is rhythm, the sense of participating in a pattern that has been followed for generations and will continue for generations to come. And there is, in most cases, a lack of the rushed panic that characterizes so much modern waking, that feeling of being late, behind, insufficient to the demands of the day. Medieval people woke into a world that moved at a human pace. Yes, there was work to be done, and much of it was hard, unrelenting, physically demanding. But the time available for that work was understood to be finite and natural. You worked while there was light, and when darkness came, work ceased. You worked at the pace your body could sustain, because there was no machinery to speed things up or make you feel inadequate by comparison. You woke when waking was appropriate to your life and season, and this varied from person to person, day to day, season to season. There was also more acceptance of rest, of the body's need for sleep, than modern culture allows. If you were tired, if you had worked hard the day before, sleeping a bit longer or taking a midday rest wasn't seen as laziness but as practical wisdom. The siesta, the afternoon rest, was common in warmer climates and during summer months, even in northern regions. After the midday meal, when the sun was hottest and energy naturally flagged, people would rest, not from idleness but from the understanding that working through exhaustion was counterproductive, that the body needed rest to maintain its strength. Children especially were allowed to wake naturally, to sleep as long as their bodies needed. A child's sleep is different from an adult's, deeper, longer, more essential to growth and development. Medieval parents, lacking our modern obsession with scheduling and productivity, generally let children sleep until they woke on their own, unless there was specific reason to rouse them earlier. This meant children grew up with healthy sleep patterns, their bodies allowed to develop their natural rhythms undisturbed. The elderly too were granted respect in their sleep needs. An old person might sleep more lightly, wake more frequently through the night, need to rest more during the day. This wasn't seen as a problem, but as a natural part of aging. Grandparents in multi-generational households would wake when they woke, rest when they needed to rest, their accumulated years earning them this flexibility. There were, of course, exceptions. Times of crisis demanded different patterns. During harvest, everyone worked long hours and slept less. During war or siege, normal rhythms were impossible to maintain. During times of plague or disaster, exhaustion and fear disrupted all patterns, but these were understood to be exceptions, temporary disruptions of the normal order, not the constant state of being. What strikes a modern person contemplating medieval waking is perhaps this: the integration of it into a whole life. Waking wasn't separated from sleeping, which wasn't separated from working, which wasn't separated from praying, which wasn't separated from eating and loving and living. Everything flowed together, part of a unified experience of being human. You didn't switch between different modes: work mode, home mode, sleep mode, as if you were different people in different contexts. You were simply yourself, moving through the natural rhythms of the day, responding to its demands and opportunities as they arose. This integration extended to the spiritual dimension of life as well. Waking was a spiritual act, a moment to give thanks, to orient oneself toward God, to acknowledge the gift of another day. Many people's first conscious thought upon waking was a prayer, often the same prayer every day, creating a ritual that sanctified the transition from sleep to consciousness. This could be as simple as "Thank you, God, for this day," or as elaborate as a full morning prayer recited from memory. The physical act of rising from bed could also be ritualized. Some people would make the sign of the cross before setting foot on the floor, blessing their body and the day ahead. Others would touch a religious medal or icon they kept by their bedside. These small acts weren't superstition but ways of grounding the self in faith, of connecting the mundane act of getting out of bed with a larger framework of belief that gave their lives meaning. For those living in religious communities, the integration of waking and prayer was even more profound. The entire structure of the day was built around prayer, and waking for the night offices was seen not as an interruption of sleep but as the fulfillment of sleep's purpose. You slept so that you could wake to pray. Prayer was primary. Sleep was merely preparation for it. This might seem harsh to modern sensibilities, but many who lived this life found it deeply satisfying. There is something profoundly meaningful about being woken not by your own needs or by arbitrary mechanical demands, but by a call to something greater than yourself. To wake because God calls you to prayer, because your community needs you, because there is sacred work to be done. This gives waking a weight and significance that purely personal or economic reasons cannot match. And yet, there was also room for simple, secular pleasure in waking. The farmer who stepped outside his cottage to find a perfect spring morning, the air soft and filled with birdsong, the world green and growing, he felt joy in this, a pure delight in being alive to witness such beauty. The mother who woke to her baby's first smiles of the day, the innocent happiness of a well-rested infant, she felt love and wonder that transcended any religious framework. The medieval world, for all its focus on the afterlife and spiritual matters, also recognized and celebrated the goodness of earthly life. Waking was a return not just to duty and hardship but to pleasure and beauty, to good food and human connection, to the satisfaction of work well done and the comfort of rest well earned. Each morning was a renewal, a chance to experience again all the things that made life worth living. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, as the world transformed from darkness to light, medieval people greeted it not with groaning or resistance but with acceptance and often with joy. The day had begun. Work awaited. Life continued. And they were here to live it, awake and aware, ready to meet whatever challenges or blessings the hours ahead might bring. This was the gift of waking in the medieval world, not just the opening of eyes but the opening of the whole self to the possibilities of the day, grounded in purpose, connected to community, trusting in the rhythms that had sustained humanity since the beginning of time. And so our gentle journey through medieval mornings comes to a peaceful close. We've walked together through monastery corridors filled with candlelight, stood on cold shores waiting for dawn with fishermen, listened to church bells calling across misty valleys, and felt the warmth of rekindled fires pushing back the darkness. We've discovered that our ancestors didn't need shrill alarms to wake them. They had something far more beautiful, a world that moved with natural rhythms, communities bound by shared sounds and purpose, and bodies attuned to the ancient dance of darkness and light. Thank you for spending this time with Medieval Sleep Tales. If this journey brought you peace, please like this video and subscribe for more cozy escapes into the medieval world. Share your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from fellow travelers through time. May your own mornings be gentle, your rest be deep, and your days be filled with purpose and peace. Until next time, from Medieval Sleep Tales, sweet medieval dreams.